How my father destroyed his family to save it. The day the certified letter arrived, my father didn't rage like other men. He simply laid the foreclosure notice on the kitchen table, its red ink wound on the polished oak, and studied it with the quiet intensity of an architect examining a compromised foundation. What I didn't know then was that he wasn't seeing an ending, he was designing a controlled demolition, and our family was the structure he had to tear down to save what mattered most. Tuesday was a day of straight lines. In the life Marcus had built, it was the load-bearing column of the week, solid, predictable, and without ornamentation. The sun would cut a perfect angle across the floor of his study, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing over his drafting table. His pencil, a sharpened extension of his will, would whisper across the vellum, coaxing blueprints into existence. It was a world of right angles and calculated stresses, a world where every variable could be accounted for and every structure was designed to stand. Outside, his wife Elena moved through her garden, a counterpoint of planned chaos. Her domain was one of fragrant blooms and stubborn roots, a place where life erupted in curves and colors that defied rigid geometry. Their son, David, sat at the kitchen table, the drone of his history homework a familiar hum in the background symphony of their afternoon. Their home, a structure of Marcus' own design, was a testament to this balance, clean modern lines softened by the untamed green of the world pressing in through wide glass panes. It was a good life, a solid one, built with care and precision, a fortress against the unpredictable. The groan of the mail truck's brakes was the first discordant note. It was a familiar sound, but today it seemed to linger, heavy and metallic in the quiet air. David saw the mail carrier walk up the long driveway, not with the usual bundle of letters and magazines, but with a single, stiff envelope and a digital scanner. Elena met him at the door, wiping soil from her hands onto her apron. She signed the screen with her finger, her brow furrowed in mild curiosity as she took the crisp, green-trimmed envelope. She brought it into the study. Marcus didn't look up from his work, his focus an impenetrable wall. Certified, for the firm, she said, her voice holding a question. She placed it beside his array of pencils. He finally paused, setting his pencil down in its designated groove. He picked up the letter, his thumb testing the sealed edge. The return address was that of the firm's primary lender, a bank they had partnered with since his own father had laid the first foundations of the company. A sense of professional obligation, not alarm, settled on his features. He slid it open with a practiced, clean motion, using the edge of a T-square. David watched his father's face as he read. It was like watching a crack appear in a sheet of impossibly thick glass, a silent, catastrophic splintering that began from a single, invisible point of pressure. The color didn't drain from his face, instead, his expression seemed to harden, to petrify. His gaze went from the top of the page to the bottom, then back to the top. The muscles in his jaw locked. He folded the letter with unnerving precision, creasing it once, then twice, before standing up from his chair. He walked out of the study and into the dining room, placing the small, white rectangle in the exact center of the polished oak table. He smoothed it flat. He stood over it, his hands on the back of a chair, his knuckles white. The letter sat there, a declaration of war on a field of domestic peace. Elena followed him, her initial curiosity now curdling into concern. Marcus? What is it? He didn't speak. He just stared at the document, his architect's mind rereading the black, unyielding words: notice of default. Acceleration of debt. Commencement of foreclosure proceedings. These were terms from another world, an alien language that had no business being spoken in the house he had built. Marcus, you're scaring me. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met David's across the room. There was no anger in them. There was no panic, no fear. There was only the cold, clear light of absolute certainty, the look of a builder who has just discovered a fatal, deliberate flaw in the bedrock of his own foundation. He knew, in that instant, that the structure was compromised beyond repair. And in the mind of Marcus, the only honorable response to a compromised structure was not to patch it, but to bring it down. The silence that followed was a different substance from the peace that had preceded it. The quiet of before had been a vessel, filled with the hum of life, the distant sound of Alina's trowel in the soil, the scratching of David's pen. This new silence was a weight, a pressure that muted every sound and made the air in the house feel thick and stagnant. Marcus did not raise his voice, he did not slam a single door. He simply moved through the rooms like a phantom, his presence a void where a husband and father used to be. Dinner became a ritual of unspoken tension. Elena would ask questions, her voice bright with a forced normalcy that cracked around the edges. Marcus would answer in monosyllables, his eyes focused on his plate, methodically cutting his food into precise, geometric shapes. He was there in body, a man occupying a chair at the head of the table, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere far colder and more desolate. The fortress he had built was breached, and he had retreated to its innermost keep, pulling up the drawbridge and leaving everyone else outside the walls. The true work began after the house fell dark. David, lying awake in his room, would hear the soft tread of his father's feet on the hardwood floor around midnight. Drawn by a mix of fear and curiosity, he crept to his doorway one night and peered down the darkened hall. A single blade of light sliced the gloom, emanating from the dining room. He padded silently toward it, his bare feet cold on the wood. He stopped just short of the doorway, concealed by the shadows. The dining table, the same one where the certified letter had lain like a funeral wreath, had been transformed. It was no longer a place for family meals but a sterile field of operation. It was covered in bankers' boxes, their lids cast aside to reveal stacks of manila folders. Thick, bound ledgers lay open, their spines broken. In the focused pool of a single desk lamp, Marcus sat, a sentinel over a landscape of paper. There was no rage in his posture. No grief. David had expected to see a man undone by disaster, perhaps with his head in his hands or a look of despair on his face. Instead, he saw a pathologist performing an autopsy. Marcus worked with an unnerving, surgical precision. On his left lay a stack of supplier invoices, on his right, bank statements fanned out in chronological order. A laptop glowed with a complex spreadsheet, itself a tapestry of numbers. With a ruler and a red pen, he drew fine, straight lines connecting one column in a ledger to a withdrawal on a statement. He wasn't just reading, he was dissecting, tracing the flow of capital like a physician tracing a disease to a patient's veins. His movements were economical, stripped of all wasted motion. The soft click of his calculator was the only sound punctuating the silence. He would pause, his gaze fixed on a specific entry, his expression unreadable. Then he would make a notation in a small, black notebook, his script tight and controlled. David watched for nearly an hour as his father meticulously excavated the financial history of the company, following a barely visible trail, punting for the precise point of hemorrhage. He was a man who had spent his life building things, and now he was applying the same methodical rigor to the act of unbuilding, to understanding how his creation had been hollowed out from the inside. At one point, Marcus seemed to sense he was being watched. He didn't turn his head, but his hands stilled over the calculator. His shoulders, rigid with focus, relaxed by a fraction of an inch. "Go to bed, David," he said, his voice low and even, not a command but a statement of fact. It carried no warmth, only a deep, profound weariness. David retreated without a word, the image of his father seared into his mind. He lay in bed, listening to the faint, rhythmic ticking of the calculator keys from downstairs. He understood then that his father wasn't just trying to figure out what went wrong. He was mapping the enemy's movements, learning the shape and nature of the serpent that had entered their garden. He was forging a weapon, not of iron or steel, but of numbers and facts, in the cold, silent forge of the midnight hour. For a week, the house was a library of ghosts. By day, Marcus moved through the rooms with a preternatural calm that was more unsettling than any outburst. By night, he was the sole patron of his grim archive, the dining room lamp a solitary beacon in the darkness. He had worked his way through the primary ledgers, the documents that told the company's official story, and found them to be a work of fiction. The numbers balanced, the columns aligned, but they told a tale of steady profit that was fundamentally untrue. The foreclosure notice was the reality, the books were the lie. Now he was in the wilderness of the fine print, navigating the dense undergrowth of purchase orders and subcontractor agreements. It was here, in the mundane details, that the truth often hid. He wasn't looking for a single, glaring error. He was searching for a subtle, repeating distortion, a structural weakness that, multiplied over time, could bring down an entire edifice. He found it in a series of payments to a company called Orion Holdings. The invoices were for logistical and site consulting services, a term so vague as to be meaningless. In the world of construction, specificity was keen. You paid for cubic yards of concrete, for linear feet of copper pipe, for man-hours logged on a specific job site. You did not pay for logistics. The payments were monthly, always a round number, and they had started nearly 3 years ago, a small trickle that had steadily grown into a torrent, siphoning the lifeblood from the firm. Marcus leaned back, the leather of the dining chair groaning in the silence. He had built this company alongside his brother, Leo. Marcus was the architect, the designer, the man who lived in the world of blueprints and stress tolerances. Leo was the front man, the charmer who smoothed things over with clients, who negotiated with unions, who managed the chaotic, human element of the business. Marcus had always trusted Leo to handle the finances, not because he was incapable, but because his own mind was consumed with the act of creation. He had drawn the blueprint for their success, and he had trusted his brother to lay the foundation. He took the name, Orion Holdings, to his laptop. Public records were a few keystrokes away. The company was registered to a post office box in a neighboring state. Its listed director, a name he had never heard. It was a phantom, a corporate shell designed to be empty. But money had been paid to this shell. Real money. His money. With cold, methodical patience, Marcus began a new process of cross-referencing. He built a new spreadsheet, one column for the Orion payments, another for the firm's cash flow. The correlation was undeniable. Every time a major client payment landed in their account, a significant portion was wired to Orion within 48 hours. It was a parasite, perfectly attached to its host. The final piece of the puzzle came from a file he almost overlooked, a secondary loan taken out 18 months prior, supposedly for the purchase of a new earthmover. He remembered the discussion. Leo had insisted on it, arguing it would increase their efficiency on the upcoming municipal project. Marcus, buried in the schematics for that same project, had signed the paperwork without giving it a second thought. But as he scanned the asset logs, he saw it plainly: the earthmover had never been delivered. It did not exist. He pulled up the loan disbursement records from the bank. The funds hadn't gone to a heavy equipment dealer. They had been transferred to a newly opened corporate account. He clicked through the digital file, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. And there it was. The signatory authorization for the new account. A single name, a familiar, looping signature he had known his entire life. Leonardo H. Verick. Leo. Marcus slowly pushed himself away from the table. The lamplight cast long shadows across the piles of paper, making them look like a miniature, ruined city. There was no shock, no blinding flash of rage. There was only a profound and terrible clarity. The serpent in his blueprint had a face. The rod in the foundation had a name. It was his brother. The betrayal was not a recent event, not a single act of desperation. It was a system, a long and patient deception woven into the very fabric of the life he had built. He had been designing a fortress while his own brother was inside, quietly dismantling it stone by stone. The dawn did not bring release. It simply replaced the focused darkness of the lamp with a flat, gray light that exposed the dust on every surface and the exhaustion etched around Marcus' eyes. He did not go to bed. When he heard Alina's footsteps on the stairs, he gathered his papers, leaving only one on the dining room table. It was a single sheet from the fraudulent loan application, the one for the earthmover that had never existed. He then moved into the kitchen, the heart of the home, and waited. He was making coffee when she entered, her movements practiced and familiar as she prepared for the day. She tried a smile, a fragile attempt to mend the strained silence of the past week. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, her voice soft. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He let the coffee maker finish its sputtering cycle, the aroma filling the room with a sense of normalcy that was now a grotesque parody. He poured 2 mugs, then turned to face her, his expression a mask of cold neutrality. He slid the single sheet of paper across the smooth granite countertop. It landed between them. "I need you to explain this," he said. His voice was not an accusation, it was the tone he used with a contractor when an angle was cut incorrectly, a request for factual clarification on a critical error. Elena looked down. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't need to read the document, she recognized it instantly. At the bottom of the page, beneath Leo's ostentatious signature, was her own, rendered in a neat, familiar script. Elena Verick. It was the personal guarantee, the clause that made her as liable as the company for the $500,000 debt. Color drained from her face. Her hands, which had been reaching for the sugar, began to tremble. "Marcus, was the earth mover delivered on a Tuesday, too?" he asked, the question so devoid of emotion it was like a shard of ice. "I can't seem to find the delivery receipt." Tears welled in her eyes. "He said it was a formality," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the countertop, unable to meet his. "A cash flow issue. He said you were too stressed with the municipal designs and he didn't want to worry you. He said if I didn't sign, the bank would get nervous and it would create problems for everyone, for the family." Marcus listened, his face impassive. He was an architect, he understood pressure points. He could see now how Leo had worked, not with a hammer, but with a precise, insidious leverage. He hadn't threatened Alina's safety. He had threatened her world. He had weaponized her love for the family, her fear of shame, her desire to be the peacemaker who smoothed over the rough edges. "He said it would all be sorted in a month," she continued, her voice breaking. "He made me feel like I was protecting you. Protecting this house. Protecting David." The last word was a sob. "Protecting me," Marcus repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at her signature again. It was his wife's hand, but the intent behind it felt foreign, as if written in a different language entirely. It was a language of fear and coercion, a dialect he had never learned because he had never believed it could be spoken in his own home. He had built walls to keep threats out, never imagining the most dangerous one was already inside, whispering promises of protection while holding a pen. He picked up his coffee mug and turned away, looking out the large window at the garden she so carefully tended. The trust between them, the foundational assumption upon which their entire life was built, was gone. It had not just been cracked, it had been pulverized, leaving behind a void. He now saw the full scope of the rot. It wasn't just in the company's books, it was here, in his kitchen, in the trembling confession of his wife. She was not a conspirator, but she had been a key. And Leo had turned her. "I need to think," he said, his back still to her. It was not a dismissal, but a statement of terminal fact. The problem was no longer just about a business, it was about the very structure of his life, and he needed to draft a new, terrible blueprint. He left the kitchen without another word and retreated to his study. This was not the dining room, the temporary morgue for his company's corpse. This was his sanctuary, the clean, well-lit space where problems were not things to be endured but to be solved with pencil and paper. The scent of graphite and old vellum filled the air, a familiar comfort. He cleared his drafting table, sweeping aside the half-finished plans for a lakeside retreat, a dream from another lifetime. He unrolled a fresh sheet of drafting paper, its blankness a stark and silent challenge. For hours, he stood over the table, not drawing lines, but mapping consequences. He was an architect of choices now, designing the structure of his own response. In the top left corner, he wrote "Path a lawsuit." Beneath it, he began to sketch a diagram. It wasn't a blueprint, it was a spiderweb. A thick line connected a box labeled Marcus to one labeled Leo. From that central conflict, dozens of smaller, tangled lines shot outwards, connecting to Elena, David, reputation, legal fees, media. He drew circles around the nodes representing time and cost, shading them darker and darker. A lawsuit would be a war of attrition, a public spectacle fought in the mud. Leo, the charmer, would thrive in that chaos, twisting truth into a matter of opinion, painting Marcus as bitter and vindictive. It would be a slow, ugly process that would bleed them dry, emotionally and financially, with no guarantee of justice at the end. It was an unstable design, destined to collapse under its own weight. He put the red pencil down. He took a sip of cold coffee. Then, in the top right corner of the paper, he wrote Path B Controlled Demolition. This diagram was different. It was not a web, but a clean, vertical flowchart. At the top, he drew a large box Veric Construction. An arrow pointed down to the next box, Chapter 7 Bankruptcy. From this, a single, heavy line descended to a crucial component he labeled the trustee. This was the key. The trustee was not family. The trustee had no emotional investment. The trustee was a legally empowered, impartial third party, an agent of the court whose sole function was to find and liquidate assets to pay creditors. He would not be the accuser. He would be a witness, a cooperative party in a legal process he himself had initiated. He would not need to scream betrayal from the rooftops. He would simply hand the trustee the keys to the archive in the dining room. He would present his meticulous findings not as a weapon, but as a map to the company's hidden assets, the money Leo had stolen. A lawsuit was a personal attack. Bankruptcy was a clinical procedure. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. To deliberately take an axe to the tree his own father had planted. To burn down the house to get at the termites. It was a monstrous, counterintuitive act. Everyone would see it as a failure, a public admission of incompetence. He, Marcus Veric, the man who built things to last, would be forever known as the man who tore down his own legacy. He looked at the two diagrams. One was a chaotic, bloody stalemate. The other was a clean, brutal, and efficient process. A demolition, when planned by an architect, is not an act of chaos. It is an act of precision. Charges are placed at critical stress points. The fall is calculated. The goal is to bring the structure down upon its own footprint, minimizing collateral damage, clearing the ground for something new. Leo had rotted the foundation. To try and save the compromised structure would be a fool's errand. The only logical, the only safe, course of action was to bring it down. His decision made, a cold calm settled over him. He picked up the phone. He didn't call his personal lawyer. He looked up the number for the most respected corporate bankruptcy firm in the city. When a stern-voiced paralegal answered, Marcus' voice was steady and clear, the voice of a man commissioning a service. "My name is Marcus Veric," he said. "I am the president of Veric Construction. I need to schedule a consultation to discuss filing a petition for voluntary liquidation." The filing was a quiet, bureaucratic act. A packet of papers submitted in a downtown office building, an exchange of signatures, a docket number assigned. There was no ceremony to it, no grand declaration. But its effects rippled outwards with the silent, destructive force of a shock wave. The first David knew of it was when the sign in front of the Veric construction yard was taken down. One day it was there, a proud monument of blue and white steel bearing his grandfather's name. The next, it was gone, leaving only two stark concrete posts standing like tombstones in the gravel. The news broke in the local paper, a small article in the business section with a headline that felt like a physical blow. Veric Construction folds after 60 years. The article used words like insolvent and liquidation. It portrayed Marcus as a man who had failed, who had run his father's legacy into the ground. There was no mention of fraud, no hint of a deeper story. There was only the simple, brutal narrative of failure. The community's reaction was immediate and cold. The Vericks had been respected, a pillar of the town. Now, they were a cautionary tale. Friends of his parents crossed the street to avoid them at the grocery store. Invitations to neighborhood barbecues stopped coming. The phone, once a constant source of friendly chatter, fell silent. It was as if their family had contracted a social disease, and everyone was afraid of catching it. At school, David felt the chill most acutely. He and his younger sister, Maya, went from being just kids to being the Verick kids, objects of whispers and pitying glances. Friends they had known since kindergarten became awkward and distant. He overheard conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. The shame was a constant, heavy cloak he couldn't take off. He and Maya were adrift in a sea of confusion. Their mother, Elena, had retreated into a fragile shell, her days spent in the garden, her face a mask of quiet grief. She offered no explanations, only sad smiles and reassurances that everything would eventually be okay. Their father, meanwhile, remained a remote, calculating presence in the house. He hadn't told them his plan. He had simply informed them, in the same dispassionate tone he used for everything now, that the company was closing. He offered no comfort, no apologies. He just kept working at his dining room table, now organizing his files for the trustee, preparing for the next phase of his demolition. One afternoon, David found Maya crying in her room. She was holding a framed photo of the whole family, including Uncle Leo, at the company's last summer picnic. "Why is Dad doing this?" she asked, her voice small and broken. "Why is he letting everyone say these things about us?" David had no answer. He felt a hot surge of anger at his father, at his coldness, at his seeming indifference to the pain they were all feeling. He stormed downstairs, ready for a confrontation, ready to demand an explanation for the public humiliation their family was enduring. He found Marcus in the garage, methodically sorting through tools. "Why?" David's voice cracked. "Why are you just letting this happen? Don't you care what people are saying? That you failed? That Grandpa's company is worthless?" Marcus stopped what he was doing. He turned, his gaze level and steady. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't try to justify his actions. He simply looked at his son, and for the first time in weeks, David saw not an architect, but a father. The look was not one of anger or indifference, but of profound, controlled sorrow. "Sometimes," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm, "a building is too sick to be saved. The only clean thing to do is take it down to the studs. People will only see the dust and the rubble. They won't see the new foundation until much, much later." He then turned back to his tools, the conversation over. It wasn't the answer David wanted, but it was an answer nonetheless. It was the first hint that the destruction was not the end goal. It was a clearing. They were living in the dust cloud of a beautiful, terrible implosion, and all they could do was trust the architect knew what he was doing. The meeting took place in a soul-crushing conference room on the 14th floor of a glass tower downtown. The air was dry with the scent of recycled air and old coffee. Marcus sat on one side of a long, polished table. On the other sat Ms. Evelyn Reed, the court-appointed trustee. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, a veteran of 1,000 corporate autopsies. She had seen every kind of failure, every flavor of desperation. She looked at Marcus with an expression of weary professionalism, expecting another sad story of bad luck and worse decisions. "Mr. Verick," she began, her tone clipped and efficient as she opened a thin folder. "As you know, my role here is to identify all assets of the Verick Construction Corporation, liquidate them, and distribute the proceeds to the creditors. Your cooperation is required by law. Let us start with the asset schedules you filed." Marcus slid a single, heavy binder across the table. It was bound in black, with a simple white label on the spine: Supplemental Asset Disclosure. It landed on the table with a solid, definitive thud. Ms. Reed raised an eyebrow. "Supplemental?" Your attorney already filed the official schedules. Those schedules, Marcus said, his voice calm and measured, reflect the company's official financial state, which I can no longer attest to be accurate. This binder contains my personal audit. It documents what I believe to be significant, unaccounted for transfers of corporate funds. He did not use the word stolen. He did not say embezzled. He did not mention Leo. He framed it as a matter of due diligence, a responsible officer of a failed company helping the court to create a complete and accurate financial picture. He was not an avenger seeking justice, he was an architect pointing out structural anomalies in the final inspection. Ms. Reed opened the binder. The first page was a master flowchart, a meticulously drawn diagram tracing large-scale fund movements over the past 3 years. Arrows connected client payments to corporate accounts, and from there, a series of bold, red arrows diverted to a box labeled Orion Holdings and several other unfamiliar entities. Each red arrow was annotated with a date, a check number, and a precise dollar amount. For the next 2 hours, Marcus walked her through the evidence, page by page. He presented the Orion invoices for consulting, placing them side by side with bank statements showing the corresponding electronic transfers. He showed her the loan documents for the non-existent earthmover. He provided the public records for the shell corporations, all tracing back to post office boxes and anonymous registered agents. His presentation was sterile, factual, and utterly damning. He was not telling a story of betrayal, he was providing a dataset. He had organized the evidence with the same precision he would use to design a skyscraper. Each section was tabbed, each document cross-referenced. He had built a paper trail so clear, so logical, that it required no emotional interpretation. The numbers spoke for themselves, and they spoke a language of calculated theft. Only at the very end did he present the signatory card for the fraudulent loan account. He laid it on the table without comment. Ms. Reed looked down at the looping signature of Leonardo A. Varick, then back up at Marcus. Her sharp, professional gaze softened for just a moment with something that looked like understanding. She saw it all now, the motive behind the seemingly self-destructive bankruptcy, the cold fury simmering beneath the calm exterior. You understand, Mr. Varick, she said, her voice retaining its formal tone, that if these findings are accurate, they suggest criminal activity. My duty as an officer of the court would be to refer this matter to the United States Trustee's office, who would likely involve the Department of Justice. I understand, Marcus replied. My only intention is to ensure that all of the company's assets are accounted for, so that all of its creditors can be made as whole as possible. Where the assets lead is a matter for you and the courts to determine. He had not made a single accusation. He had simply paved the road with facts, a road of good intentions leading straight to his brother's door, and then handed the map to the one person with the legal authority to walk it. The process, once set in motion, was as impersonal and unstoppable as a glacier. Ms. Reed, true to her duty, filed a formal report with the regional office of the United States Trustee. The report, citing significant financial irregularities and potential undisclosed assets, landed on the desk of a forensic accountant. The accountant reviewed Marcus' binder, his own professional curiosity piqued by the sheer clarity of the documentation. It wasn't the usual mess of panicked, disorganized finances he was accustomed to seeing in a bankruptcy case. This was a blueprint of a crime. The referral to the Department of Justice was inevitable. Within a month, 2 federal agents appeared unannounced at the Varick construction yard, which was now a sad, locked-up boneyard of silent machinery. They had a warrant, not for Marcus, but for every financial record the company had ever produced. They were the wolves, arriving to pick over the bones of a dead business. But Marcus had ensured they wouldn't be sniffing at his door. Leo, insulated by his own charm and the public narrative of his brother's failure, was utterly blindsided. He had heard about the bankruptcy, of course. He had even called Marcus, his voice thick with false sympathy, offering to help out in any way he could. It was a call Marcus had taken with cold, monosyllabic civility before hanging up. Leo had likely assumed the company's collapse would bury his crimes forever, that the mess of debts and liquidation would be a perfect smokescreen. He believed the wolves had come for the carcass of Varick Construction, never imagining they were actually hunting him. The first he knew of the true danger was when his bank called. It was a courtesy notification. A federal judge, acting on a sealed request from a U.S. Attorney's office, had issued a freeze on all assets connected to Orion Holdings and a half-dozen other entities. The money, the secret life it financed, was suddenly locked away in a digital vault to which he no longer had the key. Panic must have set in. The charming, easygoing facade that had served him so well would have cracked. He would have called his lawyers, his voice no longer smooth and confident, but sharp with fear. He would have discovered that the investigation wasn't about a simple business failure. The charges being considered weren't about mismanagement, they were bank fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. These were crimes with teeth. The agents who visited Marcus were different from the ones who had raided the yard. They were polite, professional, and their questions were precise. They met him not as a suspect, but as a primary witness. They sat with him at his dining room table, the same table where he had first uncovered the rot, and they went over his binder. He answered their questions with the same detached clarity he had used with the trustee, providing facts, not feelings. He detailed the company's standard operating procedures, explaining how the financial controls he had trusted his brother to manage had been systematically bypassed. He was building again, but this time, he was not using concrete and steel. He was building a case for the prosecution, providing them with a perfectly engineered structure of evidence. He gave them the floor plans to his brother's secret empire. The trap, so patiently and quietly set, had sprung. Leo was now isolated, his stolen wealth inaccessible, facing a federal investigation that had been handed a near-perfect roadmap to his guilt. Marcus had done nothing more than hold a light to the truth and let the agents of the law follow its beam. He had turned his brother's own greed and complexity against him, creating a labyrinth of evidence from which there was no escape. The indictment came 6 months later. It wasn't a surprise, merely a formality. The grand jury, presented with the crystalline evidence of the shell corporations and fraudulent loans, had acted swiftly. Leo's face, once a staple of the local business journal's society pages, was now a grainy mugshot on the evening news. The narrative in the community shifted overnight. Marcus was no longer the incompetent son who had squandered his inheritance, he was the stoic, wronged brother. Pity replaced scorn. The same neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid him now offered awkward, sympathetic nods. But the shift brought no comfort. Pity felt just as hollow as contempt. The trial itself was mercifully short. Faced with the overwhelming, irrefutable paper trail Marcus had assembled, Leo's high-priced lawyers advised him to take a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of bank fraud and 1 count of money laundering. His charm, so effective in boardrooms and at country clubs, was useless against the cold, hard facts of a federal balance sheet. Marcus attended the sentencing hearing. He sat alone in the back of the polished, silent courtroom. He did not go for catharsis or to gloat. He went because an architect must see a project through to its completion. He watched his brother, dressed in a suit that now seemed too big for him, stand before the judge. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a pale, twitching anxiety. He listened as Leo gave a rambling, tearful statement full of regret and apologies, a final, desperate performance for an audience of one. Marcus felt nothing. It was like watching a stranger. The judge's voice was devoid of sympathy. He spoke of the violation of trust, the calculated nature of the deception, the damage done not only to the banks but to the community's faith in local business. The sentence was handed down 7 years in a federal prison. A forfeiture order was issued, seizing all of Leo's assets, the luxury cars, the hidden accounts, the vacation condo, to begin the process of restitution. The quiet crack of the judge's gavel echoed in the vast, empty space of the courtroom. It was the sound of a final, load-bearing wall giving way. Justice, in its cold, mechanical form, had been served. Marcus walked out of the courthouse into the bright, indifferent afternoon sun. There was no sense of victory. The outcome he had so carefully engineered had come to pass, but the result was a wasteland. He had won, but what had he won? The family name was cleared of debt, but it was now permanently linked to a federal crime. The stolen money would be returned to the banks, but the years of trust and shared history it represented were gone forever. He had exposed the rot, but the demolition had left a gaping hole in the center of their lives. That evening, the silence in the Varick house was heavier than ever before. The weight of the unspoken had been replaced by the roaring silence of what was now known. Elena moved through the rooms like a ghost, her face etched with a grief that was both for the brother-in-law she had once cared for and the husband she had lost. David and Maya were quiet, old enough to understand the mechanics of what had happened but too young to grasp the profound, tectonic shifts beneath their feet. Marcus stood in his study, looking at the two diagrams he had drawn on that single sheet of vellum what felt like a lifetime ago. Path A lawsuit. Path B controlled demolition. He had chosen the cleaner path, the one with less collateral damage, the one that led to a definitive, legal conclusion. He had executed the plan with an architect's precision. And now, standing in the cleared lot where his life used to be, he was confronted with the final, unchangeable truth of his design. Even a perfect demolition leaves nothing but rubble. The rubble had to be cleared. With the legal proceedings concluded, Marcus turned his methodical focus to the final phase of the demolition, dismantling his own life. The first casualty was his marriage. There was no shouting match, no final, dramatic confrontation with Elena. Their relationship had died on the morning he slid the loan document across the kitchen counter. What remained was a hollow structure of shared habits and memories, and it, too, had to come down. They sat at the dining room table, the site of so many forensic discoveries, and spoke of separation. Her tears were not of protest, but of a sad, final acceptance. She had been a victim of Leo's manipulation, yes, but she had also made a choice. She had chosen to keep a secret, and that choice had acted as a slow-acting poison on the foundations of their trust. Marcus, for his part, could not unsee her signature on that document. He could not unknow her complicity, however coerced. For an architect, a compromised foundation is the one flaw that can never be forgiven or repaired. It must be abandoned. The next to go was the house. The beautiful structure of glass and wood that he had designed as their fortress was now just an asset to be liquidated. He put it on the market, along with their cars and anything else of value that was not nailed down. He was not just satisfying the last of the bankruptcy court's requirements, he was cauterizing a wound. Every object held a memory, and he needed a clean slate, a tabula rasa upon which to build something new. He, David, and Maya moved into a small, rented townhouse on the other side of town. It was a generic box with thin walls and cheap fixtures, a world away from the light-filled, custom-built home they had lost. The space was cramped, the room small, but it was theirs. It was a shelter, not a statement. For the first time in months, Marcus began to emerge from the cold, calculating shell he had inhabited. He cooked dinners, helped with homework, attended Maya's soccer games. He was no longer just the architect of their survival, he was trying to be their father again. The conversations were stilted at first. David and Maya were wrestling with the loss of their home, their mother's absence, and the public shame of their uncle's imprisonment. They looked at their father with a mixture of awe and fear. He was the man who had brought down the sky, and they were still learning to live in the world he had created in its wake. One evening, while helping David with a physics problem involving stress and load-bearing capacities, Marcus finally gave them a piece of the truth. "I didn't destroy the company," he said, his pencil tapping a diagram of a bridge truss. "It was already gone. It was a hollow shell, eaten out from the inside. All I did was push it over before it could fall on top of us." It was a simple, structural explanation, the only kind he knew how to give, and it was the first thing that seemed to make sense to them. With the small amount of capital he had left after settling every last debt, he started over. He rented a tiny, one-room office above a bakery. He hung a simple, unadorned shingle in the window. Varick Design Integrity Consulting. He would not build great structures anymore. His name was too tarnished for that. Instead, he would consult for other firms, for banks and investors, reviewing blueprints and project plans, looking for the kinds of flaws, structural and financial, that he now knew how to spot better than anyone. It was small, honest work. The foundations were sound. He was building a smaller house, a smaller life, but the walls were stronger. The materials were no longer trust and assumption, but truth and vigilance. It was a life built not for show, but for permanence, founded on the hard, barren ground of his own making. Years later, David Varick, now an architect himself, would sometimes find his hand hovering over a fresh sheet of vellum, the scent of graphite and paper a portal to the past. He worked in a small, well-lit office, a firm he had co-founded, one built on a reputation for obsessive thoroughness and unshakable integrity. His own blueprints were known for their clarity and precision, for their lack of ornamentation. Every line had a purpose. Every structure he designed was built to stand. He had learned the craft from his father, but he had learned the why from the demolition. For a long time, he had remembered that period of his life only as a chaotic, shameful blur of whispers in school hallways and the echoing silence of a house that had ceased to be a home. He remembered the raw anger he had felt, the sense of being cast adrift by the one man who was supposed to be his anchor. He had seen his father as a cold, distant agent of destruction, a man who had voluntarily pulled the pin on their entire world. But time, and his own study of how things are built and why they fall, had given him a different perspective. He could see it now, not as an act of rage, but as the most difficult architectural problem his father had ever faced. The family, as it existed, was a beautiful but fatally compromised structure. It had a magnificent facade, the respected business, the lovely home, the veneer of a perfect marriage, but its foundations had been poisoned by lies. The rot was too deep, the corruption too integral to the load-bearing columns of trust and finance. A lesser man, a more sentimental man, might have tried to patch it, to prop it up with more lies or denial, hoping it wouldn't collapse. But Marcus Varick was not a sentimental man. He was a builder. And a builder knows that you cannot build anything true on a rotten foundation. So he had made a calculated, agonizing choice. He had become the demolition expert of his own life. David understood the coldness now, the surgical precision. It hadn't been an absence of feeling, it had been a containment of it. Rage and grief were luxuries you couldn't afford when you were placing the charges. One misplaced emotion, one impulsive act of personal vengeance, and the whole thing could have come down sideways, crushing everyone. Instead, his father had planned the implosion with breathtaking care, ensuring the structure would fall in on its own footprint, destroying only what was already dead. He had sacrificed the business to expose the crime. He had sacrificed the marriage to excise the complicity. He had sacrificed the house and the wealth to pay every debt, to leave the ground clean. He had willingly taken on the public shame of failure to protect his children from the private poison of a lie. What he had saved, David now realized, was the only thing that could be saved their future. He and Maya had grown up in a smaller house, with less money, but they had grown up in the clean air of the truth. Their inheritance was not a company or a stock portfolio, it was a moral blueprint. It was the knowledge that integrity was worth more than any facade, and that sometimes, the most courageous act of love is to tear something down. David visited his father on a crisp Saturday afternoon. Marcus now lived in a small, meticulously kept condo, his old drafting table the centerpiece of the living room. He was older, his hair a shock of white, but his eyes were still the same, clear and assessing. They didn't talk much about the past. They didn't need to. They spoke of work, of new materials, of the elegant solution to a tricky engineering problem David had encountered on a recent project. As David was leaving, he paused at the door. "I was reviewing the schematics for the old municipal project," David said, the words coming out unbidden. "The one you were working on when everything happened. It was a brilliant design, Dad." Marcus looked up from his newspaper, a flicker of something ancient and deep in his eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The foundation was sound, he said simply. It was all the explanation that was ever needed. David walked out into the sunlight, finally understanding. His father's actions had not been an act of revenge against his brother. They were a necessary, defensive war fought to protect his children. He had destroyed his family to save it. And what remained, when all the ash had settled, was not rubble, but a clean, hard, and honest piece of ground upon which they could all, finally, build again. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't preserving what is broken, but having the courage to tear it down to the studs. We started this story with a man examining a compromised foundation, not with rage, but with the cold precision of an architect. In the end, we see his controlled demolition wasn't an act of revenge, but a painful, calculated plan to save the only thing that mattered: his children's future. I hope this story gave you as much to think about as it gave us here at Content Channel. It really explores the impossible choices that arise when family loyalty and moral integrity collide. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Marcus could have ever forgiven Elena, or was their separation an unavoidable consequence of her complicity? Thank you for being here with us today, and we'll see you in the next one. We'll be telling the story of what happened to Leo in prison, and the unexpected lesson he learned about the true cost of his betrayal.